All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill, and I'm director of the Transportation Research and Education Center here at Portland State University, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. So, our sorry. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the Portland State University's urban campus that is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, and Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on our on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar is hosted fully online. Today, we are very pleased to have Roberto Requejo, Program Director of Elevated Chicago, who will be presenting on forging equity in cities using equitable transit-oriented development as a blueprint for policy and practice. Roberto is an urban planner specializing in transit-oriented community development with a focus on affordable housing, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion learner, leader, and practitioner. He has led Elevated Chicago as its program director since April 2017. During the last 18 years, Roberto has helped public, private, and nonprofit organizations, including the Chicago Community Trust, the Chicago Fed, City Community Capital, and Metropolitan Planning Council, become more effective, inclusive, and equitable. Before jumping in to the seminar, I would like to let you know about a few upcoming seminars that we have. They are shown on your screen. And I think many of you receive our newsletter, and you will get announcements about them through that as well. So an overview of how today's seminar will work. Our speaker is going to be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by question and answer. We will be receiving questions through the questions feature that is shown here on the screen. So you can type a question in there at any time during the seminar, and then we will be asking them at the end. If we run out of time for all the questions, we will share them with Roberto afterwards. We are, as you noticed when you logged in, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available later today on our website. And finally, if you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Roberto, and he will start sharing his slides.
Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me to speak at these seminars, and thank you to the TREC team. And let me just start by asking, is the screen being shared? Great. So it is my pleasure to be here today to talk about Elevated Chicago, and I'm honored by the invitation. Elevated Chicago is a collaborative of community-based organizations and regional partners advancing equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD. And we have started our work within the half mile of 7 Chicago Transit Authority stations located in majority Black and majority Latinx neighborhoods. We use equitable TOD or ETOD to address racial inequities in public health, in climate resiliency, in arts and culture, and also to stop displacement and depopulation in our communities of color. And we call the 7 locations where we work equitable hubs, or eHubs. So today in this presentation, I'm going to talk about first the difference between transit-oriented development and equitable transit-oriented development. I'm also going to talk a bit about how Elevated Chicago works as a coalition to advance ETOD. And finally, I want to talk about the work that we have done in this past 4 years. So let's get started. So many of you are familiar with the concept of transit-oriented development, or TOD. As you all know, the US is a very car-centric or auto-oriented society because we have planned our cities to be that way. And transit-oriented development is a way of developing neighborhoods that, instead of centering cars, centers the needs of pedestrians and transit riders, and provides avenues and incentives to build neighborhoods that are more compact, that are more walkable, that are better connected to active transportation options. So in theory, TOD should be more racially equitable than car-oriented development. And that's because 20% of Black households in the US don't own a car versus 7% of white households. And 60% of public transportation users are people of color. So when you build with transit in mind, when you build TOD and around transit, you should be building for people of color. But that has not been the case. That has not been the case across the US, and especially in Chicago. That has not been our experience with TOD. Chicago has had an ordinance providing incentives to developers to build near transit since 2013. There's a number of incentives they receive. And while the ordinance has produced thousands of homes closer to transit and closer to jobs, it has done so inequitably. So this map here that you see on the slide shows you where TOD has been approved. And as you can see, 90% of our transit-oriented development has happened in the north and the northwest sides of the city, as well as the near the loop, and especially in the West Loop area. So for those of you who have been in Chicago, you know that those communities are either majority white, often wealthy communities, or trendy type of neighborhoods, and or also communities of color that are rapidly gentrifying, and with a lot of displacement of local residents due to this type of development. So you see how it's concentrated, right, in that segment of Chicago. But look how huge Chicago is, and look at how 90% almost of the map, or around that amount, has no TOD whatsoever, or only a little bit of it. And so those are all communities that have been bypassed by transit-oriented development. The vast majority of those communities are majority African-American. And in these areas, displacement of people of color looks like ongoing depopulation. There's a lot of families that have decided to leave the community and move out, either to the suburbs or outside of the Chicago region altogether, because they've been waiting for decades for development, for safety, for schools, for restaurants, for parks that never materialized. So I wanted to also show you some examples of the dysfunctions and the missed opportunities that we are seeing in transit-oriented development in Chicago. This is what ETOD is not, in a way. To the left, you can see a $300 million investment in a multimodal station at the end of one of our busiest train lines, the Red Line. This investment here was deployed without a transit-oriented development plan and without a deep community engagement process. So now the station, which is wonderful, sits surrounded by vacant lots and car-oriented uses. And this is not an exception, unfortunately. Many stations in the west and the south sides of Chicago, which are majority Latinx and Black communities, are, the stations are in very good shape, and they have great service and frequency, but they are surrounded by vacant land and auto-oriented spaces. So that's one of the issues we have. On the right, there is a different problem that many of you are familiar with. This here is a photo of the California station of another busy line in Chicago, the Blue Line. And this is the line that connects downtown with O'Hare Airport. And along this line, which runs along many majority Latinx communities, TOD has often displaced small businesses, renters, and homeowners. It has led to the gentrification. So in the picture, you see the before and the after the TOD arrived to the community and how evident the lack or the loss of that local ownership is. So these are the two sides of displacement that we are trying to address in Chicago. We have been very intentional in positioning ETOD as a solution to them. On the top of the slide, you see how in one of the communities where we work in Logan Square, 23,000 Latinx people have left since 2000 due to gentrification. And then overall, Chicago has lost more than 265,000 Black residents in the past 20 years, many of them coming from those communities I mentioned that have been subject to racist policies and disinvestment for a long time and bypassed by TOD. So our organization, Elevated Chicago, was created to address these inequities through equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD. We believe in the principles of TOD fully, but we also need to add that E and make sure that all TOD is done through an equitable lens. For us, equitable transit-oriented development is both an outcome, a process and an outcome. It's a process that centers the power and the voice of communities of color in development by providing opportunities not only for community engagement, but also for community ownership in new development. And it's also an outcome. And the outcome should look like affordable housing, should look like community centers, should look like health clinics, should look like small businesses near transit that address at the same time racial inequities in health, in climate resiliency, and also in cultural indicators. So this is my intro to tell you a little bit about how we differentiate TOD and ETOD, and to tell you what our philosophy is. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Elevated Chicago, our coalition. So all of these challenges and all these opportunities that I mentioned before are at the root of why we exist, and at the root of how we came about. Elevated is part of a national initiative, SPARK, the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, which brought together national partners and funders to support 6 cities in rethinking the way we do development. The challenge that we responded to in 2016 was the challenge of how to develop neighborhoods with racial equity at its center, and in ways that make communities healthier, more resilient to climate change, and more culturally and artistically vibrant. And the way we responded to that challenge in Chicago is showing to this group of national organizations and funders that we wanted to leverage a very underutilized asset in Chicago, which is our amazing transit system, and use it to spur equitable development across the city. Our steering committee is our main governance body for the coalition. It is comprised of a mix of institutional partners like the Chicago Department of Public Health, our community foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, which serves as our fiscal agent, enterprise community partners, the Metropolitan Planning Council, Center for Neighborhood Technology, and also community-based organizations located in Black and Latinx communities, from Logan Square Neighborhood Association to Emerald South. And we were very intentional at balancing power in the committee. So about half of the committee is community-based, and our leadership is majority BIPOC. So as you can imagine, with such a diverse team, we had to spend some quality time defining our shared values, our rules of engagement, and what we have in common. We came up with 5 values that guide how we ground ourselves, how we execute our work, how we measure success. And they also help us plan for the future, and they help us resolve conflicts. And everything we do in Elevated Chicago, we do through these 4 lenses that are here in this slide. The primary lens that we use is a racial equity lens, and through that lens, we look at outcomes and indicators for public health, for climate resiliency, and for access to arts and culture. And then in terms of where we work, as I mentioned before, we have started our work around 7 Chicago Transit Authority stations located in majority Black and majority Latinx communities. We call the half-mile radius around the stations EHUB, or Equitable EHUB, and they represent a variety of communities and markets, from rapidly gentrifying areas to heavily disinvested areas, to anything in the middle, and communities that are seeing both things happening at the same time. On one side of the community, there's still a lot of vacant land, a lot of vacant buildings, and on the other side of the community, they're seeing rapid change, gentrification, new business, hotels coming their way. One thing that we have been very careful about is our governance, and to make sure that we have a significant share of power between everybody that is at the helm of Elevated. So we have set up a collaborative governance structure that shares power between community-based partners and city and region-wide institutions, with that very diverse steering committee at the center. And then also with working groups and community tables that inform and execute our work plan. So all of our planning and problem solving takes place at tables where power is shared by community leaders, the public sector, and private sector institutions. And our governance has also evolved, especially during this last year. Initially, again, our governance structure was based on that steering committee. We had also 3 working groups dealing with capital and programs, systems change, and knowledge sharing. And also we had community tables located at each of the station areas where we work, and a leadership council comprised of executives from city department, CTA, mayor's office, our metropolitan planning organization, CMAP, and others. Our community tables function as bridges and connectors between the diversity of voices in the communities where we work. And our leadership council is set up not to advise us, but to listen to our community tables and to help them implement systemic changes within the city agencies and the departments represented in that council. So that has been our governance structure for about 3 years. And then more recently, we have expanded our governance with these 2 outer rings. These are expansions from last year that will inform and help govern our work more inclusively. So one of them is the ETOD working group that we co-convene with the mayor's office in Chicago since 2019. That's the gray circle that you see there. The other couple of bodies of governance are 2 cohorts. One comprised of residents from our EHUBs, our Equitable Development Ambassadors, and the other one comprised of mid and upper level leaders in the city of Chicago for a deep dive in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We call them our JEDIs, and I will talk more about this later. So, so we have talked about what is and isn't ETOD, and we have talked about how Elevated Chicago works as a coalition. And now I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about what is that we do, right? I've spent a lot of time telling you how we organize, but what is that these guys do in Elevated? So this is what the rest of the presentation is going to cover. We have a work plan, And our work plan came out of conversations with community tables on what would it take for their EHUBs to be truly equitable. And out of those conversations, we learned that in order for equitable TOD to succeed, we had to focus not only on place-based initiatives, which is a more traditional approach to TOD, but also on people-based priorities and on process or systems change efforts. So often ETOD plans and projects tend to concentrate on place a lot. So we really had to spend quality time developing resources for our people and our process priorities. And in the rest of the presentation, I will walk you through some of our work under each of those three themes that are showing in this slide. So let me start with our place-based work. So the priorities here, or the interventions, are focused on the built environment of our EHUBs and include these three types of work. Bricks and mortar, our capital pipeline, which is around $150 million of developments that we are supporting across our footprint. Green infrastructure around train stations in Chicago, and then walkability and activation programs also in the station areas where we work. So I'm gonna show you first our capital projects pipeline, or what we call our bricks and mortar. This is a group of projects that we have been supporting across the communities where we work. They all came from communities, so they're all community-driven and community-initiated developments. We use a capital screen that takes into account the racial equity impacts of the development, and we have access to local and national funds for pre-development and also as loans to support the projects. And then as you can imagine, or as you can see here, we wanted to make sure that we do not equate ETOD just with housing. So we have been very intentional in mixing housing with community centers, with health clinics. Actually, our first capital investment was for a health clinic next to transit. And also, we want to also be humble about the level of engagement in these processes, right? Like we have examples where the community engagement is a model process that took several years, engaged artists, engaged local organizers. And also we have examples where the community is still figuring out how do you bring real and authentic community engagement to a project that the city started and now requires a layer of conversations with community and a layer of community ownership processes. So in addition to the bricks and mortar, we also have a strong green infrastructure agenda. Chicago's communities of color are very vulnerable to climate change, especially to flooding. The Center for Neighborhood Technology is one of our members, and they have done extensive work on this. So we started with them a project called the Culture and Climate Resiliency, a project that brought together residents, local artists, and environmental experts to design ways to make the areas near the stations not only more resilient to flooding, but also more resilient to cultural change in the community. And communities came together with these environmental experts, with artists, and developed really cool examples of how do you deploy in a community, for instance, an eco orchard. As you can see in the slide, that is a stormwater management device, but it's also an orchard where the community is gonna be cultivating fruits and nuts and then selling those in the farmers market that they themselves organize in the area. And then the third part of our place-based work is walkability and activation programming. We have launched a walkability program funded by the Chicago Department of Public Health. And this is because development can be great and can be 100% affordable housing and located next to transit. but it cannot be equitable if the walk to and from the station is not safe, or if it's not beautiful, or if some members of our community don't feel that they are safe, walking to and from that area. We heard from many residents that don't use CTA or don't use CTA when they want, that they did not feel comfortable walking to their station. Sometimes the sidewalk was in very poor condition. Sometimes there was police harassment and brutality taking place near the stations and over policing. Sometimes there was community violence and shootings. And many of our stations are located in areas with a lot of vacant land. So some folks felt the area was very desolate to be there waiting for the bus or waiting for the train. So during 2 years, we've been working with community residents and other stakeholders on interventions to address all these issues. Some of them look like murals that you can see in this slide. Others are walkability studies and also community-driven ways of engage neighbors in programming around the area so there are eyes on the street. So I just walked you all through our place-based priorities, and I wanted now to spend some time talking about our people priorities. And our people priorities are focused on the people who live and work in our e-hubs. So part of the support that we provide is grants for our community tables to convene and to organize, and also stipends for community leaders and residents to participate in our meetings and activities. We also support a variety of research and storytelling driven by residents. And this year, we just graduated our first cohort of equitable development ambassadors. And this is a group of 25 residents from across Chicago who came together to learn how development is financed in Chicago, how to build their own equitable development, and also how to tell stories about it. And the cohort is structured as a two-way learning experience through which our members also learn about resident stories and neighborhood conditions directly from the community. Finally, we have a strong agenda on community engagement. And we started a project with enterprise community partners to find ways for residents not to simply engage with ETOD in their communities, but also to own it through co-op models, community land trusts, and other mechanisms. And finally, I just wanted to spend some time talking about our third type of priorities in our work plan, which is our process-based work. And our process priorities focus on the decision makers, government, large development companies, institutions like universities, hospitals, and others that have the power to impact how our neighborhoods look. So this slide here shows you some of our priorities in this space. As I mentioned, we have launched, or we're about to launch, sorry, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, JEDI cohort with a middle and upper level staff from the city of Chicago. We have published compendium of community engagement principles and recommendations that we encourage developers to use and have been adopted by several departments in the city of Chicago and by our metropolitan planning organization. But I would say like the biggest win that we had in systems change in Elevated Chicago was the creation of the city of Chicago's first equitable transit-oriented development plan. And I'm going to spend a few minutes now telling you a bit more about that particular systems change project, which started in January 2019 when Elevated Chicago mobilized to advocate for the City Council of Chicago to pass an ordinance different from the one that we had before that was creating all those inequities in TOD. And this new ordinance was approved with two big changes to the prior TOD ordinance. The first change was that in addition to train stations, the city was going to allow high frequency bus routes to also be eligible for transit-oriented development incentives. So if you're a developer that builds near one of those bus routes, you will receive the same incentives as if you were building near a train station. But that was not the most exciting part of the ordinance. I think we were all happy that that expansion into bus routes was going to allow more communities, especially those that do not have train stations to access TOD, receive this type of incentives. The piece that was more exciting for us is that in addition to that, the new ordinance required the city of Chicago to develop an equitable transit-oriented development policy plan. And not only that, it required the city to do it in a very inclusive way and engaging a diversity of stakeholders. So, so at that time, we, after the passage of the ordinance, we met with the city and we said, okay, let's get this done. The city acknowledged that they have limited capacity, so we play a partnership role with them in trying to set all this up. And frankly, this is not the way policy is made in Chicago and in many cities, right? So this was a startup in a way to create the infrastructure that would allow us to create a type of table that would be collaborative enough and authentic enough to work with the city in changing a lot of things that were not working for our communities. And as we were, working on all of this, Mayor Lori Lightfoot was elected. So we changed from one administration to a new administration. Although there were, some sort of challenges just passing from one to another, because the new mayor had run her campaign on a priority for equity, it was easy to move from one administration to the other. And we were invited to be part of the transition of Mayor Lightfoot. I co-chaired the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee, and we introduced in the reports of the transition the ETOD policy plan as a priority. So, so we started to work with the city on creating this joint group of city departments, community advocates, think tanks, researchers, organizers, artists, kind of group. And of course, as we are setting up that table and convening around 30 plus people, the pandemic hit. So at that time, of course, like every other city in the world, city of Chicago reconsiders, what are all our priorities? How do we work remotely? How do we take care of this emergency? How do we deploy our public health strategy to counteract and end the pandemic? And they also looked at us for help with convening this group, because the city was not, like many of us, was not ready for a switch to remote community engagement and remote work. So throughout the spring of 2020 and early summer, we convened with the city 2 virtual workshops. And we often refer to Elevated as a family, and very much family style. We decided to open the table to 80 plus experts, stakeholders who came to help us put together this plan. And what was one of the things that was very interesting for me and for people who were part of this effort is that the Department of Public Health, which you can imagine the amount of work they had coming their way when COVID hit, the commissioner, Dr. Arwady, who has been leading public health throughout the entire pandemic, she sits in our leadership council. She's the co-chair, actually, and she told us, no, we need to make this happen. ETOD is absolutely necessary to end COVID-19 and to recover equitably. So definitely sign us up. Let's make sure my staff is there. And she and her team having amazing advocates to make the connection between public health and transit and TOD. So out of all that work that we did, and I have to also give a shout out to Maria Zimmerman of MZ Strategies, who's a national expert in TOD, who helped write the policy plan. Through all of this work, and with the help of all our funders from the Chicago Community Trust to Spark to MacArthur Foundation, we were able to publish in September with the City of Chicago our first policy plan, which is available online if you are interested. And I'm sure Jennifer will be letting us know how to share resources after the talk. But basically, it's a policy plan that features 36 recommendations that came out of our roundtable of community leaders, experts, city departments, etc. And we wanted to make sure when we were doing this, and this was a direct type of conversation that we had with the mayor's office, that this was not just another plan to sit on a shelf. And that if we were going to spend all this time and effort, and especially during a pandemic and during racial justice uprisings in Chicago and during an economic recession turning quickly into a depression, we wanted this to be an actionable and an implemented plan. And the mayor's office heard that clearly, because there is, in Chicago, there is a long history of unfulfilled promises. They heard our concerns and they said, absolutely, not only are we going to publish the plan, we want to put together an action plan and a timeline for implementing the policies that you guys have identified, and also a commitment to look at demonstration projects. So these are going to be examples in real life of developments across Chicago that exemplify what these policies, these new policies are supposed to create. And so the ETOD policy plan priorities, those 36 recommendations, fall under three main buckets. There is one bucket that is about building the city's capacity to support ETOD. We don't have an office of ETOD or an office of TOD at all in Chicago. We don't even have a Department of the Environment in Chicago. So there's a lot of really basic infrastructure that the city doesn't have. So a lot of the recommendations are about how do we build and strengthen the capacity of our local government to handle TOD? How do we formalize our working group? How do we help them with community engagement standards, creating scoring cards for potential developments coming to communities, and also helping them fundraise so they can have the team they need to handle this type of work. Then there was another set of policies in the plan that are about making ETOD required, easier, and more equitable. And these recommendations came out of the realization that in Chicago, transit-oriented development is absolutely voluntary for developers. And what that means is that if you're a developer who wants to build a car-oriented development, a 60-unit high-end housing with 60 parking spots or more next to a train station, you can do that. If you want to build a parking garage in that area just next to the train station, you can do that. If you want to build a gas station, you also can do that next to a train station. So we want to make sure that we create some sort of zoning reforms to make more mandatory, and also to protect the precious land near transit, to make sure that the uses that go into the areas near transit are not only compatible with public transportation, but in connection and synergy with each other. And of course, that are equitable to and are accessible to our communities of color and our low-income residents. We also want to make sure that there are pedestrian infrastructure improvements. As I mentioned before, many of our CTA stations are wonderful, but once you leave the station and start walking down the street, the sidewalk is in very poor condition, or the area is surrounded by vacant land, etc. So we want that to change. And also we want the city to redouble their efforts in affordability requirements and accessibility requirements near transit, because people with disabilities are still very much forgotten in the ETOD conversations in Chicago, and many of our CTA stations are not accessible, if you can believe that. So it doesn't matter that you build a great building nearby if people in a wheelchair, for instance, cannot access transportation. And so, and the third bucket of recommendations are about embedding ETOD principles into Chicago's comprehensive plan. Believe it or not, we have not had a comprehensive plan for Chicago since 1966. So I know there's a lot of people in this call that were not born, and I'm part of the group. And so you can imagine, right, like how far back we have to go in trying to fix the issues that plan never thought about. Because in 1966, of course, it was very car oriented. There was no environmental component whatsoever. And we're really excited about the city, finally, an administration that takes on this huge effort to, after all these decades, create our first comprehensive plan that includes equity, that includes diversity, that includes sustainability and resiliency. But we want to make sure that the principles of ETOD are clear in the new plan and inform from the very, very basic beginnings of the process. So we are engaged with the city in the planning of the community engagement part for the We Will plan. That's the name that the plan will have, We Will Chicago. And we wanted to make sure, again, that racial and health assessments of land use are present, that we build from the plans that communities have already developed over the past decades, and also that the plan prioritizes public transportation. So I'm gonna stop here. I have told you a bit about ETOD and TOD in Elevated Chicago. Then I have told you a bit about how we work. And then finally I have told you a few things about the type of work that we do. And I think this is the time now where I will entertain questions.
Great, thank you so much, Roberto. We have several questions coming in already that I will proceed with, and I'm going to do these, try to order them a bit. We had a couple questions come in about funding and wanting some more detail about how the programs and the capital projects are funded. And in particular, I think early on when you were showing some of the pictures of some of the projects, particularly the pre-development funds and where they came from and what types of activities they can cover.
Sure. So thank you for that question. And first of all, let's all acknowledge and figure out how is it that pre-development of equitable transit-oriented development or community development in general is so hard right now, because funding these projects is an absolute ordeal. And I want this to be very clear, because in order for these projects to succeed, because our system has been created to fund a completely different type of project, that is a mega development, that is car-oriented, that is supported or based on profit and not necessarily on people, we had the benefit of working with funders that acknowledge that and made our funding incredibly flexible. So a big chunk of the money that supports Elevated Chicago comes from SPARK, the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. That is a group of foundations that committed not only to fund our operations, but also to provide access to capital pools, including a capital pool for pre-development. So we drew from that pre-development pool to support the pre-development stages of our capital pipeline. And they also made available for us debt products, advantageous debt products below market. So communities could also access those loans. Throughout this process, in addition to national funders like Ford or Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or Kresge Foundation who are in Spark, we also have in our collaborative 2 community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, IFF, and Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise Community Partners set aside a portion of the dollars they receive locally from the federal government for pre-development efforts towards TOD in Elevated, and we are in debt to them because they've been providing that as a regular source additional to the Spark pre-development dollars to fund our work. And then another big funder for us has been our local foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, which is also our fiscal agent. They provide general operations, but they have also, and building on lessons learned from Elevated, they have just started their first pre-development fund that is exclusively created for Black and Latinx developers or development teams that have a strong presence of Black and Latinx developers in them. And that's an additional source that we are really excited right now can also be accessed by our community members to make TOD more accessible. But I would say that that's the hardest part, because again, our system is not created to support this type of work. They still consider these risky communities and risky projects when they are, many of them are not. And our main goal here is not to continue kind of assembling great, flexible, forward-thinking funders like that, but to impact the big capital sources in Chicago, like TIF, like state capital dollars, to work differently. So the big dollars are friendly towards this type of developments.
Great thing. And maybe one additional, I think a quick answer is, are any of the areas that you're working in also urban renewal districts, and is funding from that going into any of this effort?
It depends on the area. Some areas of Elevated are eligible for some incentives and others are not. Like for instance, the most recent program, the Opportunity Zones program, some of the census tracts in our communities are eligible. The vast majority are not. And in one really awful case, our project is across the street from the artificial boundary that the Opportunity Zone created. So in a way, they are redlining us by creating a project or program where our project is just literally across the street that defines that. So yes, so the answer is yes, some of our communities are eligible for incentives, but accessing those incentives is not easy, and communities need a lot of technical assistance and capacity building to access that. And in some cases, these urban renewal districts or opportunity zones or whatever you're gonna call it are designed top down from people that really don't know what's going on in communities, and then create situations like the one that I just described where the zone is now responsive to the need.
Great. So another question, have you found that providing monetary compensation to the community members to participate in panels, et cetera, have been effective? And what is your sense of how important that is to your project's success? And do you think it's a requirement for good engagement?
Yes. So all yes. And I think, so first of all, the compensation is not only for their time that they take off their daily works, the daily jobs as executive directors in their communities to spend our table. It's also because they bring to tables like ours and others lived experience, diversity that we just don't have. And that's a precious resource, and you should pay for that too, right? So there's several reasons why we do this. We're also an initiative based on equity, and it was very important for us from the get-go that we compensated especially communities that have been treated very extractively by everybody, from researchers to banks to foundations. And the other reason why we do this is because it creates a domino effect in a way, because then when our community partner is asked to serve in some other place, they feel more comfortable now asking the foundation or asking the government or asking the university, what is the stipend? Because this is not at all a general practice, right? And there is a ton of colleagues that are called to serve in panels, to serve in commissions that are not paid at all. So there's several reasons why this is very important. And there is, every time that we can, we emphasize to those, especially for those organizations who have endowments, who have multi-million and sometimes billion-dollar budgets, that when you invite to your table activists and community residents, especially from communities of color, and you do not compensate them, you are perpetuating the same type of racist policies that they've been going through for a long time. And in many cases, people don't have the opportunity to tell you that because you are their funder, or you are so powerful that they rightfully are worried about retaliation, right? So anyway, it's really important, again, that all of us who have access to dollars and invite people to sit at our tables, think about who needs to be paid first, how much, and also what's our role in helping others do the same thing.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions that I think might be a little related here, so I'm going to ask them both, and you can maybe it's one sort of larger answer. One was sort of raising the question of these new these new ETODs and how you protect them from gentrification. And I think related to this, I'm anticipating is sort of elaborating on any success in increasing access to affordable housing and affordable childcare through these TODs.
Sure. So that's the recipe that we are working on. So we don't have it yet. We have a bunch of tests that we are putting out there to see if that sticks. I would say that a couple of things. One is one way to make sure that the new development does not contribute to gentrification is to spend resources in doing proper and authentic and deep community engagement. And that means doing the community engagement through community-based organizations and through community activists from the area to help you understand all the risks that this new development presents towards displacement, because they know better than anyone else, right? And the second thing, and this is something that I started to mention during the presentation and I didn't go too deep into, the other thing is that a community engagement alone is not going to cut it. Now, you need to provide also opportunities for these community-based organizations and residents to be part of the development teams here and to have to be co-investors and to have a stake in these projects. So one of our most recent grants was to look at the structures that go from community engagement to community ownership. And for instance, for the buildings that I showed you earlier, how can we make sure that this is not just a tax credit deal where only the developer benefits, and instead it's a deal where the community also benefits from the monetary and the financial wealth that's being created here. Finally, I would say this is very nascent in Chicago, but we have also good experiences supporting our community partners in signing community benefit agreements, or CBAs, with developers. Our members from Logan Square, which is a rapidly gentrifying community, sat down with the developer of a old store that was being transformed into a boutique hotel, and achieved a CBA requiring that the jobs in that hotel go first to community residents. So we are testing a few models, I would say, but that's like, for us, that's the most important thing. And the question mark is, are these are these projects going to succeed, and what else do we need to put in place to make sure that development happens without displacement? And nobody has cracked that nut yet.
Okay. Could you talk a little, there's a question about sort of networking and collaborating with organizations in other cities. And I think that might relate to how you are part of the Spark network. I don't know if you want to share at all what may be going on beyond your effort in Chicago.
Yeah, no, the Spark network has been fantastic for us, because we have met people in Atlanta, in Memphis, in Denver, in San Francisco, in LA, who are going through the same issues that we're going through. And in each of those areas, there is a group like Elevated or collaborative or coalition trying to figure out all of these problems. And there's a lot of value in exchanging lessons, but what there is a lot of value too is in finding sister neighborhoods across the US, like neighborhoods that are thousands of miles away and yet have the same problem, and people see each other in the problem, whether it is gentrification or disinvestment or a project that is very similar, affordable housing, or organizing against a new stadium or organizing against a new mega development. Spark has been instrumental for us, not only because we wouldn't be here, because they were the main funder, but also because they have provided technical assistance. They have convened all these cities twice every year. So I have a very deep and rich relationship with my colleagues in Atlanta, in Denver, Memphis. We are all part of the same family now, and we have a problem, we call each other. And I think that's the type of movement we need to build in order to figure out those solutions to development without displacement. And we have, again, benefited a lot learning from places like LA and their transit-oriented communities policies that we now can test in Chicago, and vice versa. They have learned about our organizing through arts, and they are looking at how can we do that in Atlanta and other places. So yes, absolutely necessary to succeed is to have a network of partners beyond Chicago for us.
Great. And another question, if you could describe just briefly, because we are actually at 12:30, but I will ask this to clarify how you work with Chicago Transit Authority and what that relationship is.
Sure. So it's been a very interesting relationship. When we first met with them and when we were creating our leadership council, we invited them to an informational meeting. And I remember the first meeting we had with executives of CTA, all they wanted to talk about was capital improvements and capital investments in their stations. And they went on and on about all these stations that were changing and all that. And then at the very end, I said, okay, what about programming? And they looked at me like I had said a word that nobody had ever said before, right? And they said, what do you mean programming? And at that moment, I realized that our transit authority in particular, and then in talking to the executives there one-on-one, when we started Elevated, they were extremely focused in moving people from A to B. And that was it. And that's what we do, right? And we have a lot going on just with that. And it took us a couple of years sitting with them and having difficult conversations. And I have to give them props for always having a door open to us, though, in spite of all that. It took us a couple of years to have them understand that if you don't have an A and a B, your whole function doesn't matter. And what's happening is that your A and B are suffering right now, and they're going through a lot of change, and you're losing customers, you're losing communities that used to be thriving. So you have an interest too in making sure that the development near your stations is equitable. And one thing led to another, and through a number of demonstration projects, art that we created for their stations, and them helping us navigate all the bureaucracy through CTA, I think the situation has changed dramatically. And to the point that just coincidentally today, I just got an RFP coming out of the Transit Authority, where for the first time in a piece of land next to a train station in a gentrifying community, they are requiring an affordable housing developer or a project to use that land, which this was not thinkable 3 years ago. So it's being it's been an evolution. It's been very fruitful. It's been a bit slow for some of us, but we have in them now a true partner that we have to work with hand in hand in order to help change also that mentality that they still have about transit, and just transit into something that is more holistic.
Well, I think that is a great question to end on, actually. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and very importantly, thank Roberto for spending time with us today. After the seminar ends, you're going to have an opportunity, those of you watching will have an opportunity to complete a brief survey. And we do appreciate your feedback for the on this event. And if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter. And we did include in the chat some of the links to some of the documents from Elevated Chicago. And we can also include those when we post things after the slides after the fact. So again, thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you for all of you listening. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.